the effect of this is that it will blow apart the whole rotten structure that I've been talking about. This is not government of the people, by the people, for the people. Starmer represents government of the blob, by the blob, for the blob. And when it fails, it will be the blob that failed, not Britain.
It has been 3 years since the start of the war in Ukraine. Is Donald Trump appeasing Vladimir Putin?
Yes, in the conventional sense of the term, of course he is. But that's a term, actually, Stephen, which belongs to the old world. It belongs to the notion that we are replaying the 1930s, that we are invoking Churchill, that we have Boris Johnson striking sub-Churchillian postures on all of this. And what we've got to understand is that the rules of the game have changed. They've changed utterly. The world in which we thought we lived, in which for most of my lifetime we've lived, which is a world of the so-called rules-based international system, Rubis, has shattered. Interestingly enough, I'm now going to don the mantle of prophet. Exactly 3 years ago, on the day that Putin invaded, I predicted the end of Rubis. I predicted the fact that we are going to move into a world which looks very much like the terrible world outlined by George Orwell in 1984, in which there are great permanent blocks of the world. He outlined Oceania, which is ourselves and America, against Eurasia, which is essentially an enlarged Soviet Union, and with an uneasy southern hemisphere. And it's something like that. We now have the combined power of Russia and China. We have the so-called BRICS with India, with South Africa, with Brazil, and we have the Anglosphere, all now in extraordinary competition with each other. Because you know what we've done? We've moved back from that world of the United Nations into something like 19th century great power politics. What we need to understand is, if you look back into the 19th century, we didn't talk about a United Nations or whatever. What we did, we talked simply about the concert of Europe, because that's what dominated then, in which the great powers negotiated directly with each other. We're back in the world, Stephen, of Palmerston. The idea that countries do not have permanent friends, do not have permanent allies, but have permanent interests. And you know what? America actually has always pursued that policy of America first. We think there's something unusual about Donald Trump. Everybody has expressed horror that Trump is negotiating with the Ukraine on the basis of effectively, and again, can I explain what is going to result from this? I think we're going to see a partition of the Ukraine between a Soviet, a Russian sphere of influence and an American sphere of influence. The West will become a kind of industrial colony of America because of the extraordinary mineral resources, and the East will revert to being a dependency of Moscow. That is exactly the sort of thing that happened in the 18th and 19th centuries when, for example, Poland was partitioned between Germany on the one hand, in those days it was called Prussia, and Austria and Russia. We're going to see that world again. The trouble is, it was a world in which Britain in those days was a dominant power. It was also a world in which we were not a victim power. Let's again look at that idea of partition and how shocking everybody says it is that America will strip the Ukraine of its assets. Let's look back at the most heroic moment of cooperation between Britain and the United States. That's to say, when Roosevelt assists Britain in the Second World War. Do you know what terms he did it on, Stephen? Stripping Britain of its entire foreign reserves. The entire wealth of Victorian Britain, that Edwardian Britain, that extraordinary accumulation of the world's most successful trading power was transferred directly to America to pay for wartime help, the so-called Lend-Lease system. Now, it's really important we understand this. America did not give it to Britain free. We were stripped. We were stripped by our closest ally, right? Again, it is even more striking. Look at the aftermath of the Second World War. What is it that ends the British Empire? What ends the British Empire is America. It's Dwight Eisenhower, the president who had actually led, when he was the Allied general, had commanded the Allied forces, led the D-Day landings and whatever. What does he do? He effectively, by refusing to support Britain and France in Suez, ushers in directly the end of the British Empire. So when you look at those maps, which show Britain before 1939 ruling the quarter of the globe, to Britain at the end of the 1960s, shrunken more or less to this island, it is our American allies who are directly responsible. This is the reality of great power politics. We've been lying to ourselves. We've been pretending. We've got confused motives. And of course, the exemplar of all of this is this appalling government that we have at present, which is riddled whose policies are riddled from top to bottom by contradiction, by misunderstanding, by wishful thinking, by appalling ministers. Can you imagine sitting in the seat of Palmerston, trying to protect Britain's interests at the moment? You have David Lammy. David Lammy, who thinks that Henry VII succeeded Henry VIII, who, when he watches the smoke rise from the next papal conclave, he is on record at the last one as saying, "Isn't it shockingly racist that there will be black or white smoke depending on the skin colour of the Pope?" You have somebody as invincibly stupid as that, in theory, defending British interests.
Now, the British elites, they view this war through their own historical comparison. As I said at the beginning, they view this as Vladimir Putin is Hitler and Zelensky is Winston Churchill. And this is the only world in which they live in. The only historical comparison that these British elites and some in America view foreign policy through is the 1930s Neville Chamberlain and appeasement and so on. And it's just interesting, isn't it, that they view this very much as a moral decision, not as a pragmatic decision. They have the good guys and you have the bad guys, and we can't let the bad guys win. So how do you respond to this idea that this is all, another 1930s Putin as Hitler?
I think, again, you're asking a question which is really in parallel with your previous question, and much of my previous answer answers this question. But you've also left something out. All the European elites are basically pursuing the same model of a moralistic foreign policy. It is, of course, let's again be quite clear now, it is precisely the foreign policy that America itself led the way on, from the moment at which America becomes what's known as the unchallenged hegemon, in other words, the supreme world power. And remember, Stephen, this is a very late moment. From my life, in the early course of my lifetime, I'm born in 1945, from 1945 to 1989, America was not the sole hegemon. It was a world in which America, we can now use a religious analogy, America acted as God, but there was a very powerful devil in the form of the Soviet Union, and all international policy, the United Nations and so on, was split in this thing that we called the Cold War, right? What then happens with the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so on, and in 1989, is that there's the apparent absolute victory for the West. That's to say, for America. God has won, the devil, communism, is defeated. And the whole thing, of course, is expressed in that single most destructive article that has ever been written on foreign policy, Fukuyama's The End of History. The idea that liberal democracy had not only triumphed everywhere, but it was destined to triumph everywhere. And what we get after that point, Stephen, is a series of moralistic wars. Because remember, we are talking now, we're leaping straight over from 1937, 39, whatever, to now, what we should be looking at are all the wars of alleged liberation, of the getting rid of the tyrant, of introducing democracy that were fought with American leadership from 1989. And they're everywhere. It's Kosovo. It's the bombing of Belgrade. It's the intervention in Iraq. It's the intervention in Afghanistan. It's the intervention in Libya. Do you remember? They were all fought in the name of getting rid of the Ba'athi, of getting rid of Saddam Hussein, of getting rid of Gaddafi, of getting rid of the Taliban. We had the enemy in each one of them. We were going to impose, weren't we? Do you remember? We fought that war in Afghanistan for liberal human rights. We imagined that the women of Afghanistan, well, indeed, they may very much want to wear the miniskirt. We fought a war to enable women to wear miniskirts. And then, of course, led by America, we abandoned them. In other words, this war is another version of that war. But unfortunately, at exactly the moment that the war is entering this crucial stage, America has changed policy. The Biden administration were the last believers in this triumph of universal capitalism, of universal liberal democracy. They were the last believers. Trump and his allies passionately disagree with this and see a very different world. And we've got to adapt to it. And there's another thing, Stephen, the ludicrous mess that we've got ourselves into. What is the war? We've talked now about how the war in the Ukraine is being viewed, right? We've talked about it as a subject of foreign policy to be analysed. Can we now actually look at what is going on actually in the Ukraine? We've got to remember, of course, that the Ukraine has never really been an independent state. It is the closest remaining fragment of the old Soviet Empire. It only, the old Russian Empire, because it goes right back to the Tsars, of course. It only first appears as a quasi-independent power in 1945 when Stalin gives it a seat on the United Nations. Of course, he controls it absolutely to give Russia an extra vote. There is then the addition of various bits to the Ukraine as late as Khrushchev in the 1950s, who adds on the Crimea to do what? To increase the number of Russian speakers. So what you're doing now is it's not as that people have, again, made ridiculous comparisons. What would it be like if Britain was stripped of Kent and Sussex and whatever? The borders of Kent and Sussex have been incorporated into England for about 1,500 years. The Ukraine is a featureless plain in which frontiers have come and gone. It's been under the dominion of Poland, of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, large chunks of it under Prussia, under Hitler, under Stalin. And what's going on, Stephen, is something that is unthinkable in the world of modern Britain. It is an attempt at the creation of a nation state in blood and iron and struggle. What Zelensky represents isn't sweet international reasonable order. And here I'm not criticizing Zelensky at all. I'm just saying let us recognize the truth. He represents an attempt, and under his leadership, to forge a new nation, which is based on passionate blood and soil nationalism, in which there is a determination to assert the inviolability of frontiers, in which there is a war of linguistic conquest, in which Russian has been suppressed and the Ukrainian language is being imposed on people whether they want it or not. Now, Stephen, what do we do at home? Here we are saying we're going to support the right of the Ukraine to do all of this. Back at home, do we defend our frontier? No. It is challenged every day by illegal immigrants. Do we defend our language? No. We have a multiplicity of interpreters at vast cost in all areas of the public service. And again, there's something very extraordinary. Until very recently, to talk of patriotism, to use the Union Jack, was effectively, if not quite illegal, bad manner. Do you remember Emily Thornberry and the famous moment with White Van Man and the St. George's Cross? Have you noticed suddenly this strangest of things. People on the far left have suddenly discovered patriotism. There's that wonderful word in that wonderful phrase in Dr. Johnson, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. I'm hearing patriotism out of the mouths of so many scoundrels, beginning with people like Stephen Fry and Keir Starmer, the kind of men who devoted their entire lives to internationalism. So at the one point, we're now saying in Britain, we are going to defend a wildly assertive, violent, masculinized, look at Zelensky, always parading around in fatigues, violent, masculinized warrior culture of national self-assertion, whilst back home in Britain, we are run by one international lawyer, one human rights lawyer, Keir Starmer, and another, Richard Hermer, the Attorney General, and we're busy giving away every asset that we can in the name of international law. That people are, as you all know, GB News features this regularly, people are arrested, intimidated, charged with hate crime, this wonderful thing, non-crime hate incidents, for asserting traditional patriotic values. And yet we are supposedly all going to line up and fight for patriotic values in another country when we're suppressing them in our own. Do you see the gross confusion of motive and analysis?
You mentioned the Great Game earlier in the 19th century, and there was an interesting debate at that time between Gladstone, Disraeli and Salisbury about whether they should pursue a moral foreign policy or a pragmatic one. And, you know, the thing that relaunched Gladstone's career into politics, he thought he'd retired, was the fact that Disraeli wasn't taking seriously enough a massacre of Christians in Bosnia. And Gladstone distributed thousands of leaflets, you know, criticising Disraeli's...
Young man, it's called the Midlothian campaign, and it's done, of course, with marvellous rhetoric. Gladstone, makes our current lot look feeble. Drive the Turks out to bag and baggage from the land that they have polluted with blood, and all the rest of it. And do you know what he's called? He's a liberal. It's called liberal interventionism. And it is this notion that you fight a war on behalf of values. Now, at least, let's get this right. Gladstone believed in those values. Gladstone was a patriot. The people who succeeded him in the Liberal Party were patriots. They were prepared to fight and fight in the name of those values in the First World War. It was a Liberal government that took us into the First World War. What we're dealing now, of course, is this gross contradiction. We've abandoned the values of Gladstone at home, and we're defending them abroad. You see what I mean? The complete insanity. Gladstone is also famous for something else, Stephen. He is famous for financial probity, for building up the economic strength of Britain. Whereas, of course, Starmer and his lot, as we've seen in the few months that this government has been in office, are completely crashing the economy with grotesquely extravagant state expenditure, which leaves absolutely no room for proper military expenditure. You can only, again, let me reminisce, because it's very important. As I said, I think I was right at the beginning, 3 years ago. I then had a confrontation with this vaguely lefty economist, and I asserted right at the beginning, because I know more like Putin's invasion of the Ukraine than you do, but I just think we've got to understand it properly. I said on TV, what we've got to understand is that right, that's to say, what we are allegedly defending, liberty, freedom, equality, all of these things that matter so profoundly to us in the West, needs might. Because what I was doing was, I was saying, there's no point in striking postures on these things unless you've got an army to defend it. Do you know what 3 years ago Paul said to me when I insisted that right needs might? He said, "You're a fascist." He immediately said, right, you're saying the sort of things that was being said by German ideologues in the 1930s. And now, have you suddenly noticed this gigantic reverse ferret by every lefty on Twitter? They're suddenly draping themselves in Union Jacks. They are clamouring for armies to march. They're saying we've got to have European armies. We must stand shoulder to shoulder. These are the... And again, look at the person leading Europe, Ursula von der Leyen. Do you remember what she was before she had that job?
She was a defence minister in Germany, yeah.
And what happened to the German armed forces?
It was, there was lots of corruption scandals, but she didn't boost the armed forces.
So you really, it's always better, Stephen, may I offer you a little advice to use concrete example rather than abstract nouns. Under von der Leyen's management of the German armed forces were reduced to taking part in a NATO exercise using broomsticks instead of guns. That is the level of leadership we've seen. You see, again, let me explain what's happened. What was Britain's role in this period from 1989 to 5 minutes ago when Trump succeeded? We were jackal to Americans' lion. We had two functions. Although we could contribute hardly any serious troops, and what we did, we made it look, because the Union Jack was alongside the Stars and Stripes, it made it look as though it wasn't just a national force, an American force, imposing Western values in Kosovo, Western values in the Ukraine, Western values in Afghanistan, Western values in Iraq, Western values in Libya. It made it look as though it was an international force, the international community doing it. All the time, we were steadily reducing our capacity actually to do anything. And you look at the shameful, again, let's call things by their proper names, the shameful record of overreach of the British Army and Navy throughout those campaigns. Look at Basra. Look at the shame of the Helmand province, in which we thought we could match the American forces in, peacekeeping or whatever it is, and we utterly and completely failed. And that was the vanity of the position we held, that we could act somehow as a joint world peacekeeping force alongside America by spending a fraction of what America does on defence proportionately. And there's another thing that we did. We acted bizarrely as the principal mouthpiece of this stuff. In other words, the importance of international law, the importance of foreign aid, the importance of net zero. Our politics are a politics of complete fiction. Instead of spending money on the armed forces, and by the way, the Conservatives are at least as complicit and involved in all of this as the Labour Party. What does Cameron say we're going to be? He says we are going to be an international aid superpower. Instead of spending money on the armed forces, you fling it at every organisation, huge sums, and so much so they're so big that they have to be, because of Treasury rules, you've got to fling hundreds and thousands and millions away at the end of the budget every year because you haven't actually spent it. And you give it to any kind of organisation you can think of. And then what's the other thing? So that, in a sense, is continuing under the Labour Party. And by the way, there's that wonderful phrase of my old colleague at LSE, Peter Bauer, on the subject of foreign aid. What is foreign aid? It is taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. That's what it does. It also does something else. Humanitarian aid is catastrophic. It's catastrophic in Africa because we've given them modern medicine without modern economies. The fact that the population of Africa is booming is because of humanitarian aid. Normally, if you don't have a modern economy, disease carries off children. Because we're actually stopping that happening, you have this booming population which is entirely incapable of being employed at home. Let's take another instance. The other thing that we've done, of course, is sign ourselves up to net zero, which again was a major part of the policies of the last Biden administration. It is now perfectly clear we are completely destroying our own economy. And what's most interesting, and at the same time, we boost the economy of China. And what's most interesting, our extraordinary pursuit of net zero, which remember is legislated in its present form by Theresa May, not by Labour, but Labour enthusiastically pursuing it. What it does in particular, Stephen, is make it entirely impossible to build a serious munitions industry at exactly the moment when we need to be increasing the actual weaponry of our armed forces. We have electricity prices, energy prices, 4 times higher than any of our industrial competitors. So again, this notion, you see, we're going to be an international aid superpower. We're going to be a net zero superpower. This is the notion that the world is, as it were, is looking on in wonder, applauding, saying, oh, Britain is at the cutting edge of our values. Again, it's this myth of Britain as the Athens to America's Rome. The Americans being a bit thick and stupid, they supply the muscle for this wonderful advanced view of human and international relations. But Britain supplies the intelligence, it supplies the themes, it supplies the rhetoric. Our new flagship, as it were, the prow of the flagship of noble internationalist aid superpower, losing my voice in my enthusiasm. Net zero superpower is a kind of gilded and naked Stephen Fry on the warship of British. The whole thing is silly.
And the NHS is the envy of the world. That's
and the NHS, all of this stuff. I mean, sorry, do you understand what I'm trying to say? We have had a complete policy at home, are having a policy at home and abroad of entire rhetorical fiction. In the same way, this government thinks it can bring about growth by talking about growth. This is the rain dance. For all government policies are operating, the entire way government policy is operating is to suppress growth. If you increase regulation, if you increase wages to people who don't deserve them because their productivity is low, as it is throughout most of the public sector, if you increase taxation, you are guaranteed not to have growth. And yet at the same time they say, oh, growth is our first commitment. In other words, we have here, and it shouldn't surprise anybody, because we've got a government dominated by lawyers and university lecturers and people in the public sector. They somehow believe that incantating the right words will actually bring about policy and change. What Trump is doing, and it's magnificent, he's crude, he's brutal, he's in many ways preposterous, this orange figure, but he's confronting people with the things that there are, with the fact that there are brutal facts, that the world is real. You cannot magic. You can't magic growth. You can't magic military strength. You can't even, especially you can't even, magic what I would call proper political virtue. A state that actually runs itself well and can help others to run themselves well is an enterprise that demands courage, it demands self-sacrifice, it demands genuine patriotism, it demands a genuine understanding of the world as it is, not the world as you would like it to be.
So perhaps Donald Trump, and I do want to stick on the theme of America, I think this is fascinating, the shift in America's foreign policy under Donald Trump, and I want you to sort of outline the significance of that. Perhaps Donald Trump is a kind of Lord Salisbury figure, because you have to remember you had this fantastic diplomat who became Prime Minister at the end of the 19th century, who was extremely pragmatic, who saw the world as it is and not how he wanted it to be. Unlike, frankly, Gladstone. Is Donald Trump a kind of Salisbury-esque figure? Is he becoming a more kind of pragmatic, from a foreign policy perspective, a more kind of pragmatic politician? And what does his election mean for the American empire? What's the significance of this?
Well, I think, above all, what it means, quite simply, is an open recognition that the American government will put American interests first. That's what MAGA means. It's America first. But what I'm arguing, actually, Stephen, is in reality, it's less of a change than you might think. I think America has always put America first. Look, for example, at BlackRock. Look at Larry Fink. When America was pursuing the policy of allegedly spreading global peace and light, trying to impose freedom and democracy at the point of a gun. Of course, BlackRock went along with that and made an absolute fortune on it. Now it's the enormous reverse ferret has happened. I'm sure BlackRock will lead the investments in the Ukraine, and the direct exploitation of resources there. And what our problem has been that we've dealt in words, where they deal in power and money. We used to do the same. In the 19th century, there was that absolute hard-nosedness. Can I tell you a little story again about America? You're talking about American power. Do you know where, in as it were, theoretical terms, the final reserves, in the sense of the last legal instruments of the American Federal Reserve are held? It's a bank account number in the Bank of England. Because that, of course, was the dominant force of the 19th century, when we managed our currency properly, when we made sure that our industries worked, that our exports flourished, that we had an appropriate navy and an appropriate army to defend them. Of course, and we didn't always get it right. I mean, you're talking of the period of the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th. There was a catastrophic lapse in the quality of the British Army, and the British Army was nearly defeated in the Boer War in Africa. But what we did then, from 1905 onwards, you set up this extraordinary committee of imperial defence under the direct influence of the king, under the direct influence of Edward VII. It's chaired by a remarkable man called Reginald Brett, Viscount Esher, and it brings about a complete reform of the British Army, which actually makes it capable of fighting the First World War. But that was because we were still realistic. We dealt in real terms and real power. We've retreated into this world of complete fiction. America came very close to doing it. I mean, remember all the diseases that we have here, of DEI, of critical race theory, of transsexualism and all the rest of it. They all begin in America, and they're represented in the Democrat Party, and they were embodied in the in the Biden administration. But America again took the right decision in the last election. I understand everybody who is repelled by Trump. On the other hand, politics isn't about being nice. It's about being right. One of our terrible problems in Britain is we value niceness. We value the sort of person, that you really like a nice neighbour. Yes, well, we all like nice neighbours, but unfortunately, that really isn't the criterion of public policy or foreign policy. I mean, the whole of Europe is devoted to this concept of niceness. We've decided we don't want vigorous nationalisms, but then who's going to fight? I mean, what young man is actually going to fight for Ursula von der Leyen?
But it's not really niceness, is it? Because, they allow native people to be murdered, frankly, by Islamist terrorists, terrible crimes to occur.
But Stephen, all in the name of being nice. I mean, our letting in immigrants is because we mustn't be nasty to asylum seekers. It's all in the name of our entire policy of suppressing comment on the problems of a multicultural society and race relations is because we mustn't hurt people's feelings. I mean, going back. What is a non-crime hate incident, but a determination to use the law to protect protect people's feelings. The idea that that being offensive becomes a crime is it's the final conclusion of British politeness. And there's a name for it. It's when, as it were, your sensibilities, which in some ways facilitate good human relations. And again, that world that George Orwell talks about so magnificently at the end of the Second World War, at the beginning of the post-war period, when he comments on England as being the kindest and gentlest society that's ever existed. But that was the homogenous England of the time. When you try and practice policing by consent or whatever in a society ridden by intercommunal difference, I'm afraid you hand power to the bad guy. If you try to be excessively nice, you commit a kind of suicide. What Europe has done, what we in Britain have done in particular, we've committed the suicide of niceness.
And the same, I think, can apply to a country like Sweden, which was an incredibly civilized society and has now been, sort of turned into a complete hellhole with bombings and everything else.
It's committed suicide.
Yeah, I want to ask about the European reaction to Trump, though. I think this has been fascinating. In the Munich Security Conference, J.D. Vance made this now famous speech criticising European leaders for their policies on everything from mass migration to freedom of speech. The chairman of that conference broke down in tears. He was so upset about J.D. Vance's speech.
Do you see what I mean about sorry, just one quickly. Do you see what I mean about niceness? That man spent his entire life thinking he was being nice. He lived entirely in a world of words. And suddenly, it's like somebody farting in church. I mean, Vance's speech was farting in church. Here was somebody who denied the faith, who pointed out that, again, other phrases, the emperor had no clothes. Europe has been parading naked, literally naked in the world. We've been spending nothing on defense, and we've been assuming that America would protect us. We've been advancing all these claims to wonderful values, and all we've ever done is talk, and we actually destroy, as you pointed out, as I pointed out, this generalized suicidal niceness is destroying, as Dan said, the very values it's supposed to be protecting. In other words, I go back to my exchange. Right needs might, at home and abroad. It needs courage. It needs all the unfashionable masculine virtues. Because again, much of this, I will no doubt be shot down even more, is the result of the feminization of politics. It is the result of the giving priority to caring, to looking after, to protecting against risk.
Okay, let's talk about the European reaction again, like I mentioned, to Trump. The AfD did very well in the German elections, not quite well enough to form a government, but it looks like there's going to be a new German chancellor from the CDU. And he's been talking about how Donald Trump doesn't seem to care about the future of Europe, and he's talking about European independence. Ever since the end of the Second World War, the US has had a massive amount of military presence on the continent, and that has led to complaints from many on the left and the right, from nationalists who say we shouldn't be America's lapdog. Enoch Powell was a famous example of this, who was furious that Britain had basically become a kind of a sort of subservient state to the United States. Do you think that with Donald Trump's election, with his actions in Ukraine, with his kind of intimidation over NATO and so on, will this finally force Europe to become independent of the United States for the first time since 1945?
You should rephrase that question. Will it force us to spend a serious amount of money on defence? I see absolutely no sign that it will. I mean, what is allegedly, not allegedly, at the very moment that he's going to go across to present his backside to be caned in DC, what is Starmer doing? He's arguing about whether we should increase, perhaps over 5 years, defence expenditure from 2.3% to 2.5%, when the minimum we should be looking at is 5%. again, look at the likely new Chancellor of Germany, Merz. He has explicitly ruled out going into a coalition with the AfD. That means he will have to go into coalition, once again, bizarrely, with Scholz's party, with the SDP. They are absolutely opposed to any serious increase, as far as I can see, in military expenditure. They're absolutely opposed to any serious control of immigration. They're absolutely opposed to anything that actually needs to be done. France is bankrupt. The rumours are that it will actually require the equivalent of a bailout from the European Bank. I mean, what are we going to do? The only countries, again, let's be quite serious about this, Europe does not exist. Can we stop talking about it? To go back to those wonderful realists of the 19th century, Count Metternich, the Chancellor of the Austro-Hungarian, well, he wasn't, it was then the Habsburg Empire, the Chancellor of the Habsburg Empire says Italy is a geographical expression, it's not a country. Europe is simply a geographical expression. Even those bits of it that belong to the EU. The only countries that are taking this seriously are the countries that need to take it seriously. Finland is taking it seriously because it's got a border with Russia and it's only just recovered its full independence from the monstrosities of the Russian invasion. Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, above all, now the most successful economy in Europe, that is genuinely rearming because they see the necessity. Do I think Germany is going to free itself from this extraordinary politics of the naked emperor? No, I don't. Do I think Italy will? Do I think Spain will? No, I don't. Do I think Britain will? It is impossible under this government. And we've got to recognise this. It is a genuinely terrifying position. We have, on the one hand, the government and again, the opposition. The opposition, in many ways, were even worse. Talking, what do we have to do? We've actually got to put Putin on trial before the International Criminal Court, uttering these blood-curdling threats when we couldn't resist. I would reckon we could resist a Russian attack for about 2 days, if we were lucky. In other words, we've got this politics of absolute fantasy, of confusion, of purpose, of ignorance, and unbelievable ignorance. It's terrifying. And I see no evidence of anybody seriously in power, in other words, anybody in the cabinet. I don't see any evidence of anybody in the civil service. In a funny way, Mandelson at least has some understanding of reality. The one thing nobody could ever accuse Peter of doing is not having a very shrewd sense of reality. That may be putting it rather politely, but nevertheless, I have much confidence. But he's a wholly exceptional figure.
Sticking with the theme of Germany and the German elections, some people may be surprised that the AfD only got 20%. This is 1 in 5 voters, because the issues facing Germany today seem staggeringly, difficult for them from a migration perspective, an economic perspective, cultural perspective. There seems to be endless terror attacks. Horrible things have been going on, and yet only 20% of the population voted for the AfD. The other way of looking at it is the AfD vote did double in the last 4 years, and the SPD, I think, went down to 16%, the lowest number it's gotten an election since 1887. Obviously, CDU below 30%. So maybe you can analyse that election, and just more broadly, why do you think the right across Europe, the populist right, is not winning elections?
Well, let's look at Germany. Let's begin there, because there's a very good reason, again, why I broadly support what the AfD is doing. But equally, there's a very good reason why people in Germany are frightened of it. Because, of course, much of the rhetoric is indeed some of the rhetoric that was associated with Nazi Germany. Remember, Germany reconstructed itself out of the horror of Nazi Germany by a policy in which there was a frank confrontation with the past. There was no disguise. It was a school curriculum which confronted Hitler frankly, which everybody was encouraged to look at the horrors of the concentration camps, to look at the wickedness of the persecution of the Jews, of the Holocaust. Indeed, to the extent, Stephen, in which denying the Holocaust in Germany, in Austria and so on, is actually a crime. it is actually a crime. So in other words, it was a world in which the embrace of anti-nationalism, the embrace of something else that we haven't talked about, a very peculiar view of democracy. You see, one of the things that's the clash that's going on at the moment is a clash of two very, very different views of democracy. Trumpian democracy is what we normally think of, meaning by democracy. It's unashamed majority rule. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. Government of a majority of the people, by a majority of the people, for a majority of the people. What Germany represented is a very different, and we imposed it, America and Britain, as the dominant powers when West Germany was actually turned in from an occupied zone into a state. We imposed a very different view of democracy. We imposed, and this is why you see, Merz talks all the time of America not sharing European values. It's a different view of democracy. He talks about liberal democracy. What is liberal democracy, Stephen? Well, what is it?
I don't really know that.
Right, let me tell you. You see, it's fascinating. You, as well as informed as you are, can't produce an instant answer to that question. It is the idea that democracy is not the rule of the majority, as we all think it is. It is the protection of minorities through the restraining of the majority by every source of law. And Germany, it begins this policy for obvious reasons. In other words, what we've got to understand is that the entire EU, Germany, everywhere in Europe, is fundamentally anti-democratic in the ordinary meaning of the word. It is determined to use the forces of law, of human rights, of the police, and of censorship to protect minorities against supposedly aggressive majorities, right? And every German has been brought up on that. Or rather, every German in the old West Germany has. Did you look at the electoral map of the last election? Where is the AfD strongest? It's strongest in the old East, where that sort of denazification did not happen. And there was a very, very different rhetoric used, though it, again, shared in common the attack on the notion of fascism. Now, Germany, it is perfectly understandable why you adopted that policy. What is much more interesting, again, it's quite clear why that policy was adopted for the European Union. The European Union, from its very beginning, in the Coal and Steel Federation, the alliance between the productive alliance between Germany and France way back in the 1950s, was again profoundly anti-democratic. It's the determination that the mass electorate doesn't actually set policy. When the first meetings of the Coal and Steel Federation took place, when the signatures led by when the thing was put together with, in France it was Schuman, the foreign minister. Do you know what? The process was so secret that the foreign minister didn't even tell the French prime minister when they hold their first press conference. It's so secret none of the press turn up. And so you've got to have a second stage press conference in which the press, having been carefully told what's going to happen, all sit there and pretend to write away on their notepads when of course the whole thing has already taken place. And it's why, if you actually look at the structures of the European Union, they are deliberately and explicitly anti-democratic. The Commission is not a civil service. The Commission is a bureaucracy. It is actually experts running, or pseudo-experts running the thing. The European Parliament is largely a talking shop. Now, the bizarre thing is that in Britain, although our patriotism, although the strength of our economy, although the support of the empire was the only things that enabled us to defeat Nazi Germany, we have borrowed this anti-democratic politics too. It's the politics of the left. And the way that the politics of the left have been introduced into Britain is we've decided that our record in the empire, and particularly our record on slavery, was the equivalent of Germany's record in the Holocaust. This is why there was that desperate attempt, which I was cancelled for arguing against clumsily, to pretend that slavery is the new Holocaust, is a new genocide. side. It's to undercut the legitimacy of British politics and American politics. It's why you've tried to replace in America 1776 with 1616, because you're trying again to undercut the legitimacy of democratic politics. And this again is why we now have this funny new word. Why do we have the word populism? Because populism means exactly what democracy used to mean. It means government that pays respect to what the majority wants. But we've redefined it into something else. And in Britain, it's all embodied in this strange thing called the rule of law. The rule of law is its complete invention. A major article of mine on this is just coming out at the moment. It's a complete fiction coined in 2006, which effectively says that politicians who answer to the electorate can't be trusted. This is why we see judges intervene at every single stage in the political, in the administrative, and in the economic process. And the most interesting thing I found, Stephen, when I actually researched this, I looked at the writings of the man who is responsible for this, Tom Bingham, the former principal law lord, the author of the classic book on the rule of law, a great advocate of human rights. And I want to quote now from the main lecture that he gave on the subject of human rights, because it puts into a nutshell everything that I've been talking about. What Bingham says, and I am quoting, is human rights are anti-democratic. They are counter-majoritarian. They are designed to protect unpopular minorities against the majority that the majority will not protect politically. And do you know what he goes on? He lists people like the mentally ill. Are you wondering why we've had these cases with people like Ruda Cabana and Kalokane? Because they are now bizarrely protected by the law. Do you wonder why we protect, as antisocial a group as the Roma? Well, because they're actually in his list. They're in Bingham's list. Because, of course, Hitler persecuted the Roma. So the Roma must be protected, although they're the most antisocial group on God's earth. You see what I mean? So Britain and America have experienced a process that tried to Germanize their politics. In Britain, it's the left, though with the aid of much of the liberal conservative so-called right. In America, it was passionately the Democrat Party. In America, that's been rejected with Trump. We, unfortunately, got completely out of sync, and we've introduced this politics in dramatically reinforced form with the Starmer government, which is a government of international lawyers, human rights lawyers, fundamentally anti-democratic, which is why we're seeing all of these things that GB News rightly agitates about, that the Freedom of Speech Union agitates about, which is the attempt to silence public debate.
And just finally on Starmer, one last question. How long can his government survive? I know that obviously he's got this huge majority in Parliament, so, realistically it looks like he'll survive the entire 4 years. But he's so unpopular, unprecedented levels of unpopularity in the polls in such a short period of time. How long can he truly survive politically if Labour think this is a dud when he's not going to be able to be re-elected?
I think there are so many issues here. I mean, I agree with you, the unpopularity, deservedly. But remember, this is a government that bizarrely is elected not to be popular. Forgive the paradox. We have a democratic politics in which democratic politics is supposed to be rather disgraceful. This is why Starmer constantly attacks populism. The last speech. When you think about it, it's an extraordinary thing for an elected leader to attack half his people. We are seeing, do you see what I mean? It's a body divided against itself, but also it's the internal contradictions of this government, which I think are most important. It recognises it can only survive by growth. But equally, it is committed to doing everything it can to stop growth. There's also another thing which we haven't talked about, the extraordinary business of Rachel Reeves. I've been astonished political commentators haven't looked at her more carefully. Why is there that business of faking her career up? Why the constant insistence that she is, an economist and a serious thinker? It is because Labour thought, through Rachel Reeves, that they'd come up with a means of reconciling the contradictions, right? They want, on the one hand, growth. On the other hand, because of the fact that they are the representatives of the public sector, they want to increase public sector wages. They want to increase regulation because there are a load of lawyers. They want to increase burdens on the employer by improving so-called workers' rights and whatever. What they wanted, huge net zero. What Rachel Reeves claimed to have done was to invent a new economic model. It was in the Mace lecture, which she gave last year in 2023, and it supposedly was a new method of managing the economy, which was called modern supply-side economics. It turned out, like everything else, Stephen, it will not surprise you to be stolen. Like everything else that she's ever done, it was plagiarised. It was plagiarised from Janet Yellen, who had the same job as Secretary of the Treasury in America. And in fact, it was simply the policies that the Biden government had pursued. It's old-fashioned Keynesian reflation, in which you throw a lot of money at national infrastructure, you throw a lot of money at the wages of civil servants and so on. You throw a lot of money at net zero. And America, of course, could do that because it could borrow large amounts of money. That's also, by the way, why there is the acute inflation under the Biden government. But of course, the moment you're elected in Britain, you come up with one brutal fact. You can't borrow any more money because we're bust. There was a brilliant analysis by Jason Cowley, a journalist on the left, of Reeves's Mace lecture, in which he said it was Bidenomics without the bucks. And the trouble is, it was sold to the city. Our city is now so underqualified, so unintelligent, that it bought this rubbish. If you remember, the CBI and whatever, all lined up like good little boys with their begging bowls out for the subsidy awaiting them from this new government, thinking there was going to be an economic miracle. It was elected on a lie. And the problem is that this is what will wreck it, Stephen. Its policies are mutually contradictory. They're contradictory politically, they're deeply unpopular at the time that obviously it requires re-election, they are contradictory between domestic and foreign policy, you've got to have a growing economy to maintain a serious military, they are contradictory because they are supporting aggressive, militarized and masculinized patriotism in the Ukraine, and they're suppressing it in Britain, and they are contradictory because they're economically contradictory. It cannot grow the economy with the existing policies that it's pursuing. On the other hand, it's bound by the leftish electorate. It's bound, in fact, to a large extent, by the number of MPs that it's got, because the fact that it had a landslide, this very odd, unloved landslide, it now has an awful lot of leftish MPs in Parliament. It will be very, very difficult to persuade them to go along with the cuts in welfare, with the aggressive limitation of immigration, with a genuine advancement of patriotism, with cutting back on the importance of international law. All of these things which have to be done, it will find uniquely difficult to do. I'm just hoping that the effect of this is that it will blow apart the whole rotten structure that I've been talking about. This is not government of the people, by the people, for the people. Starmer represents government of the blob, by the blob, for the blob. And when it fails, it will be the blob that failed, not Britain. But the thing that I fear is that it might actually bring down Britain with the blob.